The knock came a little after 11 on a Thursday night. Rain had been falling steadily for almost an hour, and I was standing at the kitchen sink finishing the dishes when I heard it. At first, I thought it might be the wind. Nobody visited me that late anymore. Then came another knock. I dried my hands and walked to the front door, expecting maybe a neighbor with a flat tire or someone needing help. Instead, I found Lorraine Mercer standing on my porch, my ex-wife's mother. For a second, I honestly thought I was mistaken. The last time I'd seen Lorraine had been nearly 3 years earlier, shortly after Danielle and I finalized our divorce. We hugged goodbye outside the courthouse, and I figured that was the end of that chapter. That's usually how life works. When a marriage ends, everyone quietly goes their separate ways. But there she was. Her sweater was damp from the rain, and she carried an old black leather bag I recognized immediately. She had owned it for years. What caught my attention wasn't the bag, though. It was her face. Lorraine had always been the kind of woman who smiled, even when life gave her plenty of reasons not to. But that night, she looked exhausted. "Garrett," she said softly, "I know it's late." I nodded, still surprised. "Are you all right?" She hesitated before answering. "I was hoping I could stay here tonight." There was something in her voice that made me stop asking questions. Out of everyone connected to my marriage with Danielle, Lorraine had always treated me with quiet kindness. Every holiday, she'd bring homemade peach preserves and spend more time making sure everyone else was comfortable than thinking about herself. Seeing her on my doorstep wasn't uncomfortable. It was worrying. I stepped aside. "Of course," I said. She thanked me and came inside. While I made tea, she sat at the kitchen table, holding the mug with both hands as though she was grateful simply to have something warm. After a few minutes, I asked the question anyone would have asked. "Does Danielle know you're here?" Lorraine lowered her eyes. "No." There was no anger in her answer, no resentment, just sadness. And somehow, that troubled me more. As the rain tapped against the windows, I sat across from her and realized something wasn't right. Whatever had brought Lorraine to my house hadn't happened that evening. It had been weighing on her for much longer than that. At the time, I thought I was offering my former mother-in-law a place to stay for a night or two. Looking back now, I smile at how little I understood. Because before Lorraine finally told me why she'd come to my door, I would discover something that made even less sense, and that small discovery would change the way I saw her forever. The next morning, I expected to wake up and find Lorraine gone. Honestly, I figured she would leave before sunrise, thank me for the spare room, and disappear back into whatever problem had brought her to my doorstep. Instead, when I came downstairs, I found her standing in my kitchen making coffee. For a moment, I thought I had traveled back in time, not because she'd ever lived in my house before, but because she moved with the same quiet confidence I'd seen during holidays years earlier. She wasn't trying to take over the place. She was simply making herself useful, the way she'd always done. "I hope you don't mind," she said with a small smile. "I found the coffee." I laughed. "Looks like you found it better than I do." That earned the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since she arrived. Over breakfast, I finally learned a little more. Danielle and her husband, Craig, had decided to move to Charleston. Smaller place, new opportunities, different lifestyle. At least, that was how Lorraine explained it. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the sadness in her eyes didn't. "Did they ask you to leave?" I asked carefully. She stirred her tea for several seconds before answering. "They needed the space." It wasn't really an answer, and judging by the way she avoided my eyes, she knew it. Still, I didn't push. People tell painful stories when they're ready, not when they're forced. Before leaving for work, I told her to stay as long as she needed. She immediately shook her head. "Oh no, Garrett, just a couple of days. I don't want to be a burden." I almost smiled. In all the years I'd known Lorraine, she'd spent her life worrying about becoming a burden to other people. Meanwhile, she'd quietly carried everyone else's troubles without complaint. That evening, I came home expecting to find the house exactly as I'd left it. Instead, I stopped in the doorway. The curtains had been washed. The dining table had been cleared of the junk mail I'd been ignoring for weeks. And drifting from the kitchen came a smell I hadn't experienced in years. Chicken soup, homemade. Lorraine looked up from the stove and smiled nervously. "I hope that's all right. I saw what you had in the refrigerator." And for reasons I couldn't explain, that simple moment hit me harder than it should have, because for the first time in a very long while, coming home actually felt like coming home. What I didn't know then was that Lorraine had already made a decision she hadn't shared with me. And a few days later, I would discover just how many choices she'd quietly passed up. Before knocking on my door, a couple of days turned into a week, and somehow, without either of us planning it, we settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Lorraine would already be awake when I came downstairs. There would be coffee waiting on the counter, and the local paper folded neatly beside it. In the evenings, I'd come home from the boatyard and find her sitting on the back porch, watching the river through the trees with a cup of tea in her hands. Neither of us talked much. We never needed to. Some people fill silence because they're uncomfortable with it. Lorraine seemed to understand that silence could be peaceful. And after years of noise, arguments, and trying to become someone I wasn't, peaceful was something I had learned to appreciate. One evening, while we were eating dinner, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. "Lorraine, have you spoken to Danielle since you came here?" She looked down at her plate. "No, not once." She shook her head gently. "Not once." I didn't know what to make of that. No matter how complicated things became, a mother and daughter usually found their way back to each other. At least, that's what I believed. A few days later, I came home earlier than usual because a storm had delayed work at the boatyard. As I stepped inside, I heard Lorraine talking on the phone in the living room. She didn't know I was home. "I know, Diane," she said softly. "I appreciate it. I really do." A pause. "No, I haven't forgotten about the spare room." Another pause. Then she smiled sadly. "I know I could come to Jacksonville tomorrow." She listened quietly, and then she said something that made me stop in the hallway. "No, Garrett doesn't know, and I don't think he understands why I came here." I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but hearing my own name made me freeze. A moment later, Lorraine noticed me and quickly ended the call. Neither of us mentioned what I'd overheard, but that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Jacksonville, Diane, a spare room, which meant Lorraine really had somewhere else to go. She had options, people who cared about her. So why was she here? The answer didn't make sense, and somehow that bothered me more than if she'd had nowhere at all. Because if she hadn't come to my house out of necessity, then she had come by choice, and I wasn't sure I was ready to ask myself what that might mean. But a few mornings later, I opened the refrigerator and found something sitting on the middle shelf. A small glass jar with a handwritten label. Peach preserves. And without realizing it, I stood there staring at that jar for nearly a minute. Because what I would discover behind that simple gift was something I must have stood in front of that refrigerator for a full minute. The jar wasn't anything special. Just an old mason jar with a square of fabric tied around the lid and a handwritten label in blue ink. Peach preserves. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. Lorraine's. For years, she'd brought homemade preserves to every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. It had become such a tradition that nobody even thought about it anymore. And standing there in my kitchen, I realized something. Nobody had asked her to make them. She'd done it because she wanted to. That evening, I found her sitting on the back porch. "The preserves are good," I said. She smiled. "They're not quite as sweet as the ones I used to make." "They taste exactly the same." She laughed softly. "No, they don't. You're just being polite." For some reason, hearing that laugh felt strangely comforting. We sat in silence for a while, watching the river disappear beneath the orange glow of sunset. Then she asked about work. I told her about the old fishing boat I was restoring and how the owner refused to give up on it, even though most people thought it wasn't worth saving. Lorraine listened carefully, the way she always did. "You know," she said, "I think that's why you love fixing things." I smiled. "Because I'm stubborn? Because you see value where other people stop looking." I laughed at that. But later that night, lying in bed, I found myself thinking about her words. Nobody had ever described me that way before. Over the next few days, something changed. Not dramatically, just quietly. I'd catch myself driving home from work a little faster. I'd notice that the house felt warmer when someone else was inside, and for the first time in years, I stopped eating dinner in front of the television. Instead, we'd sit at the table and talk about books, about old movies, about places we'd never visited. Oddly enough, we almost never talked about Danielle. Neither of us avoided her intentionally. The subject just never seemed to belong in those conversations. Then one evening, while Lorraine was washing dishes, I reached past her to grab a glass from the cabinet. Our hands touched. It lasted less than a second, but we both pulled away at the same time. Neither of us said anything. A moment later, she quietly finished washing the dishes, and I carried my glass out to the porch. It was ridiculous, really. We were two adults, and yet that tiny moment stayed with me for the rest of the night. Not because it meant something. At least, that's what I told myself. But a few days later, Mrs. Whitfield from next door stopped me while I was getting the mail, and the first question out of her mouth caught me completely off guard. "Garrett," she said with a curious smile, "who exactly is the lady staying with you?" I gave her a polite answer, but as I walked back to the house, something uncomfortable settled in the back of my mind. Because for the first time since Lorraine arrived, I realized other people were starting to notice, and I had no idea what story they might be telling themselves. Mrs. Whitfield's question should have been harmless, but it stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. "Who exactly is the lady staying with you?" I had answered honestly. "My former mother-in-law." Mrs. Whitfield had raised her eyebrows just enough for me to notice. "Oh," she said. Nothing more. Just that one word. But neighbors have a talent for saying a great deal without actually saying anything. By the time I got back inside, I found myself wondering why her question bothered me so much. Maybe because I wasn't entirely sure how to explain the situation myself. When I stepped into the kitchen, Lorraine was arranging fresh flowers in a glass vase. "Daisies?" I asked. "They were on sale," she said with a smile. "The kitchen looked lonely." I laughed. "Apparently my kitchen has been lonely for years." She smiled, but there was sadness behind it. I know something about lonely rooms. Neither of us said anything after that. We didn't have to. As the weeks passed, Lorraine settled naturally into the house, though she never acted as if she belonged there. In fact, she did the opposite. Every few days, she'd remind me she wasn't planning to stay forever. "Just until I get things sorted out. Just a little longer. Just until I decide what to do next." But each time she said it, there was something uncertain in her voice, and strangely enough, I hated hearing it. Not because I felt sorry for her, because I'd grown used to seeing her there. More than that, I'd grown used to us. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find her sitting quietly at the table with a photograph in her hand. She quickly turned it over, but not before I recognized the picture. It was an old family photo. Danielle, Lorraine, and me, taken years ago at a Christmas dinner. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I was putting away some things." "You don't have to apologize." She nodded, though her eyes had become distant. "Funny, isn't it?" she said quietly. "How life turns out." I sat across from her. "Have you heard from Danielle?" She shook her head. "No." "Have you tried calling?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she gave a small, tired smile. Some people make their answers clear without saying the words. I didn't know how to respond to that, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to, because the thought that Danielle hadn't even checked on her own mother made me uncomfortable. But what happened later that afternoon bothered me even more. I had gone out to the garage to grab a toolbox when I noticed Lorraine's black leather bag sitting open on the workbench. Inside, I caught sight of several envelopes, medical papers, insurance forms, and beneath them, a folded letter. The envelope was addressed in Danielle's handwriting, and judging by the date written in the corner, Lorraine had been carrying it with her since before she arrived at my door. I had no intention of reading it. But a few seconds later, Lorraine walked into the garage, and the expression on her face told me one thing immediately. She hadn't wanted me to see that letter, because whatever was inside had something to do with the reason she'd chosen my house. And for the first time since she arrived, I had the feeling that Lorraine had been protecting more than just her pride. Lorraine stopped in the doorway of the garage. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she noticed the open bag and the envelope lying near the top. Her expression changed immediately. Not anger, not fear, just embarrassment. The kind that comes from having someone accidentally see a wound you've spent weeks trying to hide. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, reaching for the bag. "You don't have to explain anything," I told her. But she stopped. The letter remained in her hands for several moments before she finally sat down in the old folding chair beside the workbench. "I suppose sooner or later you were going to ask questions." I sat down across from her. She looked down at the envelope. "Danielle wrote this 2 days before I came here." For a moment, I thought about telling her she didn't need to continue, but I could see she needed to. Not because she wanted sympathy, because she'd been carrying the weight alone. "They're moving to Charleston," she said softly. "Craig found a new opportunity. Smaller house. New beginning." I nodded. She forced a smile. Apparently, I wasn't part of the new beginning. The words hit me harder than I expected. Lorraine unfolded the letter carefully. "I don't think Danielle meant to be cruel," she continued. "She's always been practical. She said I'd be happier somewhere with people my own age, that she and Craig needed privacy. She even offered to pay for movers." She paused and looked away. But some things hurt no matter how politely they're said. I didn't know what to say, because I remembered Danielle. She wasn't heartless, but she'd always been good at convincing herself that difficult decisions were reasonable decisions. "Why didn't you go to your sister?" I asked gently. "Diane wanted me there." "Then why not Jacksonville?" Lorraine smiled sadly. "Because Diane already raised her children. She deserves her peace." "And me?" Her eyes lifted to mine. "You deserve yours too." I almost laughed. "Then why are you here?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then she folded the letter and carefully returned it to the envelope. "Because after I left Danielle's house, I sat in my car for nearly an hour." She smiled to herself. "And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of anywhere else I wanted to go." Those words stayed with me. Not because they sounded romantic. They didn't. They sounded lonely and honest. More honest than anything I'd heard in a long time. That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch watching lightning bugs drift through the yard. Neither of us mentioned the letter again. We talked about books, about music, about absolutely nothing important. And yet, somewhere between the laughter and the comfortable silence, I realized something that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had stopped thinking about Lorraine as a guest. Without noticing it, I'd started thinking of her as part of my life. And I wasn't sure when that had happened. But a week later, someone else noticed it too. And unlike me, she wasn't happy about it. because on a quiet Sunday afternoon, a white SUV pulled into my driveway, and when I saw who stepped out of the passenger side, I knew peace inside that house was about to come to an end. The moment I saw Danielle step out of the white SUV, I knew this wasn't a social visit. 3 years had passed since our divorce, but some things are easy to recognize. Danielle still carried herself with the same confidence, same perfect hair, same expression that told the world she had everything under control. Craig stayed inside the vehicle. Danielle walked up the driveway alone. Lorraine had been watering the flowers near the porch. The second she saw her daughter, she froze. No smile. "Mom," just that one Danielle word said. No hug. Lorraine slowly put down the watering can. "Danielle." For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Danielle glanced toward me. "So it's true." I frowned. "What exactly is true?" Her eyes moved from me to Lorraine. "People have been talking." I almost laughed. "Since when do you care what people say?" She ignored me. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were staying here?" Lorraine lowered her eyes. "You already knew I had left." "That's not what I asked." There was frustration in Danielle's voice, but underneath it, I heard something else. Confusion, maybe even guilt. "I called your sister," Danielle continued. "She said you refused to go to Jacksonville." Lorraine remained silent. "Mom, this doesn't make any sense." Finally, Lorraine spoke. "It doesn't have to make sense to anyone else." Danielle blinked. I don't think she'd expected her mother to answer back. For most of her life, Lorraine had quietly accepted whatever burdens came her way, but not this time. "You're living with my ex-husband," Danielle said carefully. Lorraine looked up. "I'm staying with a man who opened his door when I needed help." The words weren't angry. That made them more powerful. Danielle turned toward me. "Garrett, tell me this is temporary." I looked at Lorraine, then back at Danielle. "I don't know." And for the first time since arriving, Danielle looked genuinely shaken, not furious, not jealous, shaken, as though she suddenly realized life had continued without her permission. Eventually, she left. No shouting, no dramatic scene. She simply got back into the SUV and drove away. But as Lorraine and I sat quietly on the porch that evening, she stared at the empty road long after the headlights disappeared. "Do you regret coming here?" I asked. She answered immediately. "No." Then she smiled sadly. "I just never imagined losing my daughter would hurt this much." I didn't know how to answer that, but as I sat beside her in the fading light, I had the strange feeling that the hardest part of our story still lay ahead. Because a few days later, Lorraine would tell me something she had kept buried for years, and after hearing it, nothing between us would ever feel quite the same again. Something changed inside the house, not between Lorraine and me, between Lorraine and herself. For the first few days, she became quieter, not cold, not distant, just thoughtful. I caught her staring out the kitchen window more often. Sometimes she'd pause in the middle of reading a book and lose herself somewhere far away. One evening, nearly 2 months after she'd arrived, we sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the river. Neither of us had said much. Finally, Lorraine spoke. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. "Anything." She smiled nervously. "I almost left 3 times. I looked over at her. "What stopped you?" "The first week I packed my bag." She laughed softly. "Then I thought about saying goodbye, and somehow that seemed harder than staying." I didn't know what to say. The second time was after Danielle visited. Her smile faded. I thought perhaps she was right. Maybe I was making things difficult for everyone. "And the third?" She looked down at her hands. "The third time was last week." "Why?" "Because I realized I was becoming too comfortable." I frowned. "Comfortable isn't a crime." "No," she said gently, "but depending on someone can be frightening." The evening breeze moved through the trees. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Do you know what I missed most after my husband died?" I shook my head. "Being noticed." Her voice was quiet. Not grand gestures, not romance, just someone asking how my day was, someone remembering how I liked my tea, someone being happy that I came home. I swallowed hard, because somewhere along the way, we'd started doing those things for each other without even thinking about it. Lorraine smiled. I spent so many years taking care of everyone else that I forgot what it felt like to have someone take care of me. Then she laughed. "And before you panic, Garrett, I'm not making declarations." I laughed too. "Good, because I'm terrible with declarations." We both smiled. Then she became serious again. "When I sat in that car the night I left Danielle's house, I could have gone to Jacksonville." I nodded. "I know. But I kept finding myself driving toward your neighborhood." She looked embarrassed. "And that should probably concern both of us." I smiled. "Probably. But it doesn't." Neither of us spoke after that. We didn't need to. Because for the first time since Lorraine arrived, I stopped asking myself how long she was staying, and started wondering how empty the house would feel if she ever left. But life has a way of interrupting peaceful moments, and just when I thought things were finally settling down, the rest of Savannah started paying attention, and not everyone saw our story with kindness. Small towns have their advantages. Privacy isn't one of them. By the middle of October, it became obvious that people were talking. Nobody said anything directly, but I noticed the curious looks at the grocery store, the extra long conversations that stopped when I walked into the hardware shop. Even Mrs. Whitfield, despite meaning well, had begun asking questions that sounded suspiciously like concern. "People just worry, Garrett." I smiled politely. "They should find a hobby." She laughed, but I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. People like explanations. And Lorraine and I didn't have one, not one that fit neatly into a box. Oddly enough, neither of us discussed the rumors. Life inside the house remained peaceful. Morning coffee, evening walks, old movies, simple things, things that mattered. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. Danielle. I hadn't spoken to her in months. "Hello?" There was a long silence. Then she sighed. "Garrett, can we talk?" We met at a small cafe downtown. For the first time in years, Danielle looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. She stirred her coffee without drinking it. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I nearly dropped my cup. Danielle apologizing had always been a rare event. For what? For Mom. I didn't interrupt. "Craig and I thought we were doing the right thing," she continued. "Smaller house, new city, fresh start." She looked down, but somewhere along the way, I started treating everything like a problem to solve. I recognized that sentence immediately. It sounded exactly like the woman I'd once been married to. "I never thought she'd actually leave," Danielle admitted. "And when she did?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I was angry." She laughed softly. "Not because she left. Because she chose you." Neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled sadly. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I shook my head. "Mom talks about you the way she used to talk about Dad." I didn't know what to say, because hearing that felt strangely unfair and strangely wonderful. Danielle wiped her eyes. "Garrett, are you in love with my mother?" The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I honestly didn't know, not yet, or maybe I was simply afraid of the answer. Danielle laughed through her tears. "Relax, I'm not asking for permission slips." Then she became serious. "Whatever this is, Garrett," she smiled. "I've never seen her this peaceful." That evening, when I returned home, I found Lorraine sitting on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. "Everything all right?" she asked. I nodded. "Just talk to Danielle." Her expression changed immediately, but before she could ask another question, I sat beside her and handed her a small paper bag. She looked confused. Inside was a tiny peach tree sapling. She stared at it in surprise. "Garrett," I smiled. "I figured the backyard could use something beautiful." And as tears filled her eyes, I realized something I had spent months avoiding. I wasn't afraid of losing my peace anymore, because somehow, without either of us noticing, she had become part of it. And before winter arrived, Lorraine and I would finally have the conversation both of us had been quietly postponing. Quietly that year. The peach tree we'd planted in the backyard had lost all its leaves, and according to Lorraine, it looked about as lively as an old broomstick. I told her it was just waiting for spring. She said the same thing about people. A few weeks before Christmas, we finally had the conversation we'd both been avoiding. Not because we were afraid, because neither of us wanted to ruin something that had become precious. We were sitting on the porch with blankets around our shoulders when Lorraine suddenly laughed. "Imagine explaining this to people," I smiled. "I've stopped trying." She nodded. "So have I." Then, after a long silence, she asked the question that mattered. "Garrett, if I had somewhere else to go, would you want me to?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, because I did. I'd known for months. I reached over and took her hand. "No." Her eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, not movie tears. Just the quiet kind that appear when someone hears something they were afraid to hope for. "I don't want you to stay because you need a place to live," I told her. "I want you to stay because somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like my home and started feeling like ours." Lorraine smiled through her tears. "That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman
Danielle
who
know
makes
you're
peach
here?
preserves."
No,
I laughed.
I just needed somewhere
yet,
to feel safe.
I stand by it.
Some are warmer than others.
She squeezed my hand, and neither of us
Does
needed
Danielle
to say
know you're
anything
here?
more.
No,
Because sometimes happiness
I
doesn't
just
arrive
needed
like
somewhere
fireworks.
to feel safe.
Sometimes it
Some are
arrives
warmer
quietly,
than others.
like someone asking how your day was, like 2 cups of coffee waiting in the morning, like laughter in a kitchen that used to be silent. By spring, the peach tree had started to bloom. So had other things. Danielle visited more often, not because everything had been magically repaired, but because people grow, and because forgiveness, like trust, takes time. One Sunday afternoon, she stood beside her mother in the backyard and shook her head with a smile. "You know," she said, "if somebody had told me 5 years ago that my mother and my ex-husband would end up planting fruit trees together, I would have called them crazy." Lorraine laughed. "So would I." "And now?" Danielle smiled. "Now I think it's kind of beautiful." Last week I turned 41, and that morning I woke up to the smell of fresh biscuits and peach preserves. Lorraine was humming softly in the kitchen. The radio was playing one of her old songs, and sunlight was pouring through the windows. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, just peace. Which, I've learned, is sometimes the greatest gift life can offer. And every now and then, when I look at that peach tree in the backyard, I think back to the rainy Thursday night when someone knocked on my door. At the time, I thought I was helping a lonely woman who needed a place to stay. Funny how life works. Because it turns out, she rescued me too.